Good afternoon. You are locked in, and I'm Algenon Cash. Welcome back. Welcome back. Election 2020, we finally put it in the books, or I guess you could say it's almost in the books. We're still counting votes, but here in North Carolina, we are starting to get a bit of clarity in terms of who won some really key races, whether it be the governor's race all the way down to many of our own city council races in your own backyard. But of course, the national race, the United States Senate race, as well as the presidential race, we are still counting votes and may be counting votes for at least the next several days. And potentially you may not even know the winner of the race for at least another 4 weeks, could be a month or so before you really know who the president's going to be. But today I've got a good friend coming on with me. I've got John Hood, who's the president of the John William Pope Foundation, former president of the John Locke Foundation, and also just a great friend. One of the smartest guys I know in North Carolina, certainly when it comes to politics. So we're going to take some time here and do some political analysis, talk a little bit about the results of the race. What does that mean for North Carolina? What does it mean for the entire country? And of course, I want you all to chime in with your questions. So if you've got questions or comments, just leave them and I'll grab them and we'll work them into our discussion. John, how are you today?
A little tired, but intrigued, fascinated by this rather weird election season that we are still living in, trapped in. Choose your verb.
It is. Were you up all night like myself? I don't think I got to bed till about 3 a.m.
I wasn't up quite that late, but I was up early. I sort of figured what I should do is get the rest when I can get it. I had to file a column. My syndicated column goes out every Monday and Wednesday morning, and you have to hit your deadline. So I had a column that I drafted late into the hours of Tuesday, finalized it, sent it out Wednesday morning. Probably tonight at some point early, I will crash.
Yeah, I should have probably turned the television off, but you know me too well. I just couldn't break away from it. And
yeah. I figured out pretty quickly, honestly, by maybe 10 or 10:30, we weren't going to get the answers anytime soon from the key states. I think now we're getting them, but we didn't have them Tuesday night.
Some of them are starting to roll in. I know just before we went live here, I know they called the race for Wisconsin for Biden. Of course, President Trump is going to challenge that in the courts. Right. I think Biden may be up by just over 20,000 votes in Wisconsin. And I also know they still haven't called Michigan, but the Trump campaign is actually trying to get them to stop counting votes in Michigan. So we'll see if some judge gives an injunction or stops the process because they felt like they didn't have access to all the ballots to be able to review them. So there's still a lot going on, a lot of mess. But I finally, when I came to do the show today, I finally turned the television off. I've literally had the TV going all day long as if I can't do enough punishment to myself. But I finally turned it off. But, I do want to start off by talking a little bit about the national race. Obviously, we've already kicked into that conversation. And, I think so many people were predicting this blue wave that I heard so much about coming across the country. You had certain people predicting that Democrats could even win states like Texas and so forth. I was never really convinced. And I told people that I felt like there were 5 variables that were at play that I want to get you to react to that I felt like were causing the polls to be incorrect. One, I just felt like there was a silent majority out there who supports Donald Trump, but may not always be very vocal about it. They're not on Facebook saying it. They're not tweeting it. To some degree, some people are even embarrassed by it just because of some of the rhetoric that they hear coming out of the White House, but they do support the president. I was very impressed with Trump's inroads with Black voters. Certainly, it's not going to be a blowout when it comes to that voting bloc, but just the fact that he may have increased the Black voter turnout for his campaign from about 8% to possibly somewhere between 12 and 15. I predicted that he would do really well in Florida just because of the Hispanic outreach. I also thought that he was doing better than expected with young voters. And then also the rallies. I just thought the rallies were probably the best get out the vote apparatus you could call for. I mean, the guy did 14 rallies in 3 days right before the election. So those are 5 variables that made me believe that this wasn't going to be a blowout. What was your take on the big national race?
I agree with many or most of those points, Cash. The shift, improvement, not huge, but the improvement with black voters, with Hispanic voters. The Hispanic category in particular is kind of meaningless, but we use it in the absence of something else. He didn't do, I don't think, a whole lot better with Puerto Ricans in New York, let's say. But he definitely, you can see it in the numbers if you compare Florida's results versus previous cycles. President Trump improved with Cubans, with Venezuelans in Florida. I think it's really unimpeachable that the argument, maybe I shouldn't use that term in the context of Trump, but I think that it is certainly true that the anti-communism message, do you really want a party, some of whose leaders flirt with socialism, to be in the White House? I think that is a powerful message for people who were recently immigrants or their parents were immigrants from communist countries. So I think that was certainly true. And I also think you're right about the rallies. Rallies do, in fact, affect political outcomes. They don't convince anybody typically, but they can have at least a modest effect on turnout. And that was part of the story here. What I would add to that, and I think maybe more important actually, is that Republicans and conservative leaning groups were canvassing, were working door-to-door poll stuff in August and September when the Democrats were not. And while it is expensive and time-consuming to hire people or get volunteers and go canvass a neighborhood, it does help to juice turnout. So I think the Republicans went into the early voting, for example, in North Carolina and other states that had early voting in early October, or even mail-in ballots in September. They were doing better than their usual trend. I think part of that is the polling understated Trump's support by a little bit. I don't think it was, I think you used the term silent majority. I don't think it was a majority, but it was 2 or 3 points in a number of states of people who really supported Trump, supported other Republicans, didn't say so, but they voted anyway. And then combine that with the somewhat higher propensity to vote that Republicans and Republican-leaning independents appear to have exhibited this year. And you get the kind of numbers we saw in North Carolina in October. I pointed these out. I'm not the only one. A number of people pointed out that after the beginning of early voting, of course, the Democrats had a huge advantage in mail-in ballots. And then we saw the early voting start, and pretty quickly the Republicans were doing quite well. The Democrats were underperforming their 2018, 2016 share of the vote early. Independents were up, Democrats were down, Republicans were about even, which was comparatively better than the Democrats. And Democratic friends of mine said, oh, that's no big deal. Yeah, the Democratic share is down, but those independents are with us. They're young people. Well, young people everybody's vote counts the same. So, of course, a young person's vote is just as valuable as an 80-year-old's vote. However, 80-year-olds are much more likely to vote, or certainly 70-year-olds are. And the youth vote went up some, but it went up from a low base. So you had, 3 or something percent higher as a share of the electorate that was young. Well, the over 65 group was about 1 percentage points higher. And Algenon, that is way more people than 3% increase among the young. So while you may be right, there was some young people who were going in different directions. I don't really think the youth vote was the story here. It certainly wasn't for the Democrats, and they were counting on it. I think the story here is that the Republicans turned out, Democrats somewhat less so. If you look at the exit polling, it's a little chancy to look at exit polling. Any polling right now is suspect.
Yeah.
But I think that it is likely, and the polling is consistent with this, that far more people who voted for Trump were voting for Trump than Biden people were voting for Biden. Some of the Biden people were voting against Trump. A vote counts the same, but there was probably a little bit less energy behind Biden as we saw. And maybe that's because he wasn't doing the rallies. They didn't have the vote canvassing. Like it or not, the Democrats perceived that to be unsafe and they didn't do it. Now they started doing it in October when they realized they had a problem. So you combine all these things together with one more factor. And I think this is the factor, and I wrote about this in my column today, in North Carolina and in some other states. that may have helped explain why the swing voter, and there still are swing voters, there still are split ticket voters, a few percentage points that matter in closely divided states. There's a reason some of these swing voters went Republican this time, not just for the president, but for other offices. On average, probably these voters somewhat trust Democrats more than Republicans to combat coronavirus. On average, these voters somewhat trust Republicans more than Democrats to rejuvenate the economy. But then there was this other issue. It wasn't exactly a sleeper issue, but I was surprised how poorly the Democrats handled it and why they weren't paying much attention. And that was law and order, public safety. The demonstrations, which were heartfelt and understandable, that began in the summer, that in some cases devolved into looting and riots and destruction of downtowns, that was a bad look. that made some voters uncomfortable. And I think that may have been a sort of a tie-breaking issue for some of these swing voters. They decided the Democrats seem to be at least not clearly condemning defunding the police. And people want police reform. They want to reduce incidents like the George Floyd death. They certainly do. They don't equate that with defunding the police or hamstringing the police. And I think that issue worked for Republicans, for Trump and for other candidates.
I think you're right. I know that the RNC and, with their get out the vote effort combined with the Trump campaign, they did 150 million or reported 150 million voter contacts, which is just significant. And I thought even when those numbers were coming in that was going to make a big difference for Trump, or at least, he still may not win, but it's not this landslide victory that so many people were predicting.
I think you're right to point that out. I do think Biden is going to be the next president. I think that's the way the numbers are going. But it is certainly going to be a close electoral college outcome. It's going to be a fairly close popular vote outcome. And we will literally be, again, looking at each other thinking this is basically a 50-50 country. And in North Carolina, we're basically almost a 50-50 state.
And I was going to say, going back to your law and order point, which I didn't list that as one of my key five, but I totally agree with that assessment as well. I mean, even if you look in if you look in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where we had the Jacob Blake incident earlier this year, and then obviously the subsequent riots that was associated with that tragic incident, Trump actually doubled his support in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And I think that had a lot to do with this law and order message that you're talking about. I think a lot of other candidates, especially here in North Carolina, used that message. And I think that's part of the reason why Republicans picked up a few seats in the House and then actually maintained control of the United States Senate. I mean, if you look closer to home here in North Carolina, one of the state Senate races I was watching very closely was District 31 with Joyce Crowdick. And, she really used the law and order message against her opponent effectively, and obviously came out victorious. And I mean, that was actually probably one of the most watched races across the state.
It was one of the key races for control of the state Senate, Algenon. And also, I've mentioned this to Democrats both before and after yesterday, after Election Day. And they get indignant. They say, well, nobody's for riots. Why is this even an issue? The problem is that if you don't clearly condemn, defund the police, you give people the impression maybe that you are not personally in favor of abolishing the police department, or you're not personally in favor of allowing people to run rampant through a downtown and screw up years and years of economic development plans that downtowns in North Carolina have been working on. You may not be actively in favor of these things, but there's some reason you won't come out strongly against them. It makes people nervous and uncomfortable and suspicious. And I think that worked very hard. I think Democrats were incredibly foolish not to take that concern seriously.
The other phenomenon that I picked up on, and again, I think over the next several weeks, as more data comes out, we'll be watching all these trends, and there'll be so many people that are looking at pouring over the data to try to figure out what really happened. But one thing that we're noticing already is that even though it appears Trump was losing support amongst seniors and women, especially, due to some of his rhetoric, it also looks like he was able to bring a large number of just new voters in. I mean, people that never voted for him in 2016, showed up to vote for him in 2020. And that's despite some of the rhetoric and a lot of the establishment Republicans coming out against him and so forth. What does that mean to someone like you, John? Or what does that mean about the country? Is Trumpism, for lack of better words, is that something that's really just here to stay? I mean, despite if the president wins this election or not?
I think certain kinds of symbolic messaging and talking about patriotism and love of country and that sort of politics is definitely here to stay. Trumpism per se, I'm not a buyer on that stock because I actually think that the public will, even some Trump voters who really didn't want to buy it, they want a Democratic administration. They're very concerned about Kamala Harris. There's all sorts of reasons why right-leaning voters who don't really like Trump's style would vote for him anyway. But if you talk about those voters and certainly the Biden voters, there is a sense of people wanting some relief. They want to take some breaths. They don't want politics to be so much a part of their lives. They want to not hear from the president as much, whoever the president is. So Trumpism, if it is tweet a lot and try to dominate every day's headlines, I actually don't think that's necessarily what we're going to see in the next few years. But if what you mean is bringing new people out who didn't previously vote very often because they feel like something really, really important is at stake, the future of the country, that the existence of America as an exceptional free republic, if that's something that's really on the line, then there are going to be some voters who didn't vote in the past on matters of Social Security reform or housing policy or something that does not greatly interest them. But the notion that there would be large amounts of support for tearing down statues of George Washington, tearing down statues of Christopher Columbus, that will get people who are not very political to become political. And if that's Algenon, sort of what you mean, yes, I think some of that is here to stay. I'm not sure it's Trumpism, but it is something interesting and part of 21st century politics, and not just in America.
Maybe it's just more of a reconnection with patriotism, and where so many people, or just this idea of the whole patriotic spirit, spirit and American exceptionalism and all these kind of things. But so no, that's very, very interesting. I just as you were speaking, I just saw a notification that it appears that CNN is calling Michigan for Trump as we speak. I know, like I said, they've already called Wisconsin. So it seems like, it's really going to come down to
Trump or for Biden.
They call Michigan and Wisconsin for Biden. I'm sorry. I might have misspoke. And,
interesting to see, by the way, I don't mean to interrupt you, but it might be, have they called the Senate race in Michigan? Because John James, the Republican candidate in Michigan, was a little bit ahead of Trump. So it's possible Trump could lose, but James could win. And that would really be an interesting outcome in Michigan, wouldn't it?
I haven't seen that, but where I was going with this, I mean, it sounds like at this point, in order for Trump to win, he would definitely need Arizona and Nevada. I mean, obviously the electoral pathway is narrowing here.
Yes.
Let's assume Biden does win and, he takes the White House, but he's got a Republican-controlled Senate. Should we just brace ourselves for basically another 4 years of gridlock, or?
I think that there may be some partisan warfare. There will be some partisan warfare. I actually think that at first, at least, Joe Biden will attempt to do some sort of deal or multiple deals with his friend, Mitch McConnell. I don't know that the House will go along, but I do think that Biden has a sense that it would be in his interest and the country's interest not to come out swinging. It might be different if he had won a crushing victory. If some of the polls that showed this blue wave that you mentioned, if those had been real, and we're talking about Biden winning North Carolina and Georgia and places like that, Florida, maybe tying or getting close in Texas. If something like that had happened, Biden may not have been able to forestall a Democratic House, a Democratic U.S. Senate, and a Democratic Party that's energized and rather left-wing now. He might not have been able to do anything other than go along with a pretty aggressive legislative program. I think in the current environment where that's, of course, not going to happen, they're not going to have the Senate, and he's not going to have much of a mandate per se because it'll be a close race. I think Biden may be tempted to try to work out some deals on things like the budget and coronavirus and stuff like that. I think he'd have a willing partner depending upon the specifics with McConnell. And there might be a 6-month to a year period where it doesn't look so much like gridlock. And then the gridlock will come back because people will start positioning for 2022 when the Democrats will hope then to get the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, I know Biden certainly. I mean, obviously, he spent a lot of time in the Senate, so he really understands how it works, and he still has a lot of colleagues and friends in the Senate. That's something that I don't think enough people talk about. Yeah. And I do think that maybe one of the best outcomes for Republicans was to. I mean, obviously, it would have been great for Republicans if they could have took control of the House, but to at least maintain control of the Senate, they can provide some kind of a backstop against any kind of progressive nominees if Biden tried to appoint Elizabeth Warren, Treasury Secretary. I just don't think Republicans in the Senate would go along with that. So, it could be one of the best outcomes for establishment Republicans that were maybe hoping to get rid of Trump and get back to some sense of normalcy in terms of how government operates. So I think that's going to be interesting to take a look at.
It will be. And remember, there were also these ideas, if the Democrats had the U.S. Senate, of expanding the Supreme Court and packing it with new members, of adding additional states. That's off the table now.
Yeah. Some
and
of
that
those
would have been very interesting, but depending on how you think about it, also very unattractive.
So let's bring it back close to home. Obviously, North Carolina never fails to excite anyone, and here in North Carolina, it's increasingly looking like the state will go for Trump. I mean, I think there's about 117,000 absentee ballots out there. Biden would have to take somewhere around 83% of all of them in order to close the gap and win.
They'd be voted, and a lot of them will never even show up.
So. They may not even show up. So I think Trump's going to take the state. It feels like Tillis is going to take the U.S. Senate seat. Yep. Cooper retained control of the executive branch, but yet we've got a Republican lieutenant governor. And then when we look at the Council of State, it's somewhat well divided. I think it's 6-5 in favor of Republicans, 6-4 in favor of Republicans. And then Republicans obviously still have control of the House and the Senate. Help us understand what is going on in North Carolina. How do we get this type of an outcome in North Carolina?
We're a closely divided state where a candidate that is well financed, that's not a flaky candidate or something, they're going to start out not with 45% of the vote, but something more like 47% or 48% of the vote on either side. The swing vote's pretty small, but it is decisive. So you could say, well, used to have 15 or 20% of North Carolinians who split their tickets, and now it's only 4 or 5% or 3%. Well, that's right, and they matter because the two parties are so closely divided. Why would a voter vote for Trump, Tom Tillis, and Roy Cooper? Well, first of all, that's exactly what happened in 2016. There were a number of voters who voted for Trump and Richard Burr. Actually, Richard Burr outpolled Trump. So Burr, Trump, and Cooper. These tend to be, I mean, they're everywhere. You've got a voter like that in, but a lot of these are in rural counties. They are used to voting. Some of them are older voters. They're used to voting Republican for president, Democrat for governor. They did it under Jim Hunt, seemingly forever. He was governor for 16 years. They thought of Mike Easley as a sort of a moderate Democrat, and they voted for him twice pretty strongly. And so these voters are predisposed to do this kind of thing. And for Cooper, who's been on the ballot many times, he was attorney general. He was on the ballot 4 times for attorney general, then for governor. You might interpret him today as something other than a moderate because of his handling of coronavirus and the lockdowns and all that, and the fights with the legislature and all that sort of thing. But there are a few voters out there who still think of him as a sort of a Jim Hunt style moderate Democrat. And if you add to that something else, there are some swing voters, not very many, but enough to matter, who believe in division of power. They like checks and balances. This is why Tom Tillis explicitly said, even if you think Trump will not be president, you should vote for me because a President Biden needs a check, a Republican Senate. He said that. Actually, a few voters took him seriously. I think that's why he did a little better than Trump in terms of the share of the vote or the margin of victory. So they're also check and balance voters who probably voted for Cooper because they knew the Republican legislature was Republican and they wanted to check. And finally, and this may be, I don't know if you agree with me with this or not, Algenon, but Dan Forrest made a fundamental error by talking about masks so much. You can have doubts about the efficacy of masks. You could say, well, the masks help a little bit, but not a lot. There's all sorts of arguments you can have about it. But whether you should wear a mask in a mass gathering is not a controversial issue in North Carolina. Whether you like it or not, it's an 80-20 issue. And for him to spend any amount of time talking about it was a squandering of scarce resources. And I think a few older Republican-leaning voters who voted for Tillis, voted for Republican lawmakers, they didn't like that about Dan. They didn't think Dan Forrest was taking COVID seriously enough, and that was a fatal error on his part.
No, I totally agree with that assessment. I actually thought that was the fundamental flaw in his entire campaign. I mean, he spent the entire campaign talking to a group of people that, quite frankly, was going to vote for him either way you look at it. They were already a part of your base. And then he didn't spend any time building what I call a coalition of votes. I think he did very poorly with minority engagement, engaged in reaching out to the Hispanic and the African-American community to build a coalition there. I felt like he was a little bit absent when you look at the whole virus outbreak and the response to it. I mean, you never saw him at one single press conference. I mean, he is a sitting lieutenant governor. So I just thought there was some things around messaging and the way the campaign looked at their response to COVID where he could have been victorious if he would have just, responded much better. And I think it's really interesting when you look at the total number of votes in the state. I mean, Beth Wood, who's the North Carolina auditor, actually got more votes than Dan Forrest statewide. I mean, Dale Folwell got more votes than Dan Forrest statewide.
Dale Folwell, by the way, illustrates that Folwell was also critical of Cooper's handling of coronavirus. But he did it in a way where it sounded substantive, and he didn't sound like he was dismissing the risk of COVID. Of course, Dale Folwell himself had COVID early on in the epidemic. But so there was a way to be critical, to ask questions or argue that there was a different strategy than Cooper. So you could do that and still seem like you were serious about COVID. I think Forrest just did not find his footing, find his voice on that.
And, we also have this shifting electorate here in our state. I mean, there is this rural versus urban divide, but then you've also got a huge influx of people that are moving here from New York and other, largely urban areas. What do you think that means for the future of North Carolina politics as we continue to just see the electorate in North Carolina shift?
That trend has been going on really since the 1960s. And in the early phase of all these transplants from the North and the Midwest, this was a pro-Republican shift. It helped to make North Carolina politically competitive. Those new voters were disproportionately Republicans. North Carolinians were disproportionately Democrats. So all through the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, this demographic shift was pro-right or pro-GOP. There was a moment there in the 90s when I could travel from Charlotte all the way to Raleigh on I-85, and every single county I passed through had a Republican chairman who was from the North or the Midwest. Not a single native. But around the turn of the 21st century, that trend flipped around. The younger voters coming in from other places were more Democratic than Republican. And so that has been happening ever since, and that is changing the politics. But, a lot of these voters are not necessarily locked in. No offense, I'm stealing your term for a second, but in a different way. They're not locked in to being a Democrat or a Republican. And parties are able to work on them depending upon the issues involved. So I think you're right that it's a changing demographic. You certainly can't talk about North Carolina history and make assumptions about people knowing. I mentioned Jim Hunt, for example, and that he was governor for 16 years. It was a 24-year period. So he was 8 years in, then he was 8 years out, then he was 8 years in. But there are some people who may be watching us right now who do not remember Jim Hunt or even know what we're talking about because he left office so long ago. He left office in 2000. And so there are lots of things about that. It has become, North Carolina politics has become less exceptional because people are from elsewhere. And of course, we know diversity is part of this trend But man, have Democrats misread that, as you alluded to earlier. They just have this assumption white voters are disproportionately Republican, non-white voters are disproportionately Democrat. Therefore, as the white percentage falls and the non-white percentage rises, the Democrats are destined to prevail. This is straight line thinking. It uses very crude categories. Non-white is not a thing. An African-American voter who was born in Brooklyn and a Hmong refugee and a businessman from Bengali have very little in common politically. And they're not necessarily going to end up voting the same way in the long run. And look what happened in California. California is supposed to be this place where progressive politics is now dominant and Republicans are irrelevant and conservatism is irrelevant. And they just, again, voted down racial preferences in university admissions. Why did they do that? Is it, the national media coverage of it was appallingly silly. What actually happened is, there's a substantial Asian population in California, and they absolutely know that racial preferences mean they don't get to go to the college that they want to go to. That they know very well what that means, and they voted against it. Racial politics, ethnic politics is a complicated story. Filipinos don't vote like Chinese. As I said, Puerto Ricans don't vote like Venezuelans. And I think crude attempts to make everything about race and white and non-white, in addition to offending me, probably offending you, is also not helpful in understanding the politics we're in and the politics that we're going to be in.
If you're just not joining us, you're very late to the party, but you're locked in. I'm Algenon Cash. The other voice you hear with me today is John Hood, who's the president of the John William Pope Foundation here in North Carolina. And we're just doing some analysis from last night's election, talking about the national as well as state races. I've just got a couple more questions for you, John. Obviously, if you're out there, if you have any questions for John, please leave them in the comment section, or you can just simply leave a comment. I'll try to read that on air here. I do think you're right. I mean, I think demographics are shifting quite a bit. I was really encouraged to see that Trump actually made an attempt to reach out to black voters. And it's just so often where Republicans just concede that voting block as if they can't make any inroads there. And I thought Trump did a great job of honing in some messaging around economic opportunities, criminal justice reform, HBCUs, I mean, those kind of things. And I think, again, he's not going to pull, 80% of the black vote. So I'm not naive here. But to at least pull somewhere around 10 or 15% of the black vote starts to make a significant difference in a lot of battleground states. This is the census year. And so Republicans did keep control of the state legislature. They're gonna be controlling the drawing of districts as we move forward. We know how that sort of worked out 10 years ago. Any early predictions about what we can see once we start to redraw districts once we get the new census numbers in?
Sure. Well, it is true the Republicans will be in charge again like they were 10 years ago, but I don't think it will look very similar. There have been litigation efforts since then over the last 10 years, both on racial grounds and on partisanship grounds, that have fundamentally changed the rules. I favor redistricting reform and wanted to even have a constitutional amendment on the ballot this year. We weren't able to get it done. But I think what will happen next year, of course, parties always try to manipulate the political lines to favor themselves, but the Republicans will not have as much freedom to do so in 2021 as they did in 2011, or the Democrats did 10 years before that, 20 years before that, because of these court cases. So yes, the maps will change. North Carolina will almost certainly add a congressional seat. The Republicans will try to make that new seat Republican leaning or at least competitive. They probably can do that without violating any of the new standards. The legislative seats they're going to redraw. What will happen is the urban areas will gain additional representation. The rural districts will get bigger. The urban districts will get smaller, meaning there'll be more people represented from urban areas. But again, Republicans will try to keep that from hurting and possibly try to make it help them. But they will not have the degrees of freedom that they had 10 years ago because of these court cases.
You mentioned the court cases, and it looks like Republicans also had a good night last night in terms of these statewide judicial races. I will be honest with you, I'm a little more naive when it comes to these judicial races. What does the outcome of last night mean for North Carolina as we move forward with the court system?
It is very important if you care about a variety of issues that are currently being litigated to the Supreme Court. School choice, redistricting cases that may come up. There will be new redistricting cases, obviously. A number of other election law or other disputes like that. There's a big difference between a 4-3 Democratic court and a 5-2 Democratic court. You might say, well, it's just one seat. Well, it matters a lot. 2 of the seats will be Republican. Tamara Barringer won a seat. Phil Berger Jr. won a seat. I don't think those will be changed by subsequent balloting. The Paul Newby, Cherie Beasley race might change. Newby is ahead.
Tight race, yeah 3,000 votes.
Yeah, it's a little over almost 4,000 votes. There are potentially enough provisional and absentee ballots that could flip, and Beasley could take that seat and keep that seat. That would mean a 5-2 court. That would probably mean Republicans would have a rough time if they got to a issue of high political valence in front of that court. But a 4-3 court with Paul Newby as the Chief Justice and Sam Ervin IV as a potential swing. He's a Democrat, but not really a left Democrat. That court is a little more interesting. So I think that the Supreme Court outcome matters a great deal. And the appeals court, most cases don't get to the Supreme Court. They get to the appeals court and stop. The Republicans won all of the appeals court seats on the ballot. Again, a very important, maybe not as prominent outcome, but an important outcome.
No, I totally agree. I really, really appreciate you doing this, John. And I'm certain my listeners have gotten so much value out of listening to you analyze these races all the way from DC back to Raleigh. Thank you so much for locking in with me, and to my audience as well. Please, if you get a chance, go check out John Hood. He's available on Facebook. He's got a Facebook page. You should follow it. He's also a syndicated columnist. Writes a syndicated column every week that has great information. And he's the current president of the John William Pope Foundation. And then real quick, John, you just had a book come out, right?
Well, it's coming out. I have a novel coming out in a few months.
Well, I've been seeing all the pictures. I guess maybe you've been doing some testing and measuring with some
That's
of the
correct. Yeah.
with some of the illustrations. What's the name of the book?
It's called Mountain Folk. It is a historical fantasy novel set during the American Revolution. In other words, Daniel Boone is in it, and George Washington is in it, and Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton debate federal bills. But there are also monsters and fairies and giant battles involving sea creatures. So, it's that kind of book, Algenon. You've seen a book like that before, haven't you?
So it's like Harry Potter meets Washington, D.C. kind of thing.
It's sort of like if we told the story of the founding of America, but it was sort of like Lord of the Rings. That's what this book is like.
Well, I want to encourage my listeners to go check that out. And again, John, I appreciate you being here. You all, I will be back. We'll be having some more election stuff coming your way. We'll continue to look hard at the races. Obviously, we'll be watching the big national presidential race and see what the outcome is there. Y'all stay locked in.